start feeling good right now. Yeah, my name is Ben Manski. I do have a long history in social movements and political campaigns. Practiced law for 8 years, public interest law, constitutional law. But I'm here today to talk with you as a social movement scholar and to lay out a conceptualization of a way to, of socialism, social movements, democracy, and the construction of the blockchain world. Okay. And this image here is of, we have low resolution, so I don't know if you can see it. Can you see that all right? Okay, it's just my angle. Okay. This image is of a team of coders and media people at Occupy Wall Street in 2011, 2012. So I want to bring us back a little bit to think to 50 years ago, 1969, when 500,000 people turned out in the streets of Washington, D.C. for the moratorium on the war in Vietnam. And then move forward 10 years to the streets of Tehran, where the revolution against the Shah could have moved in any number of directions. And here at this demonstration, over 100,000 women were out in the streets, envisioning a more democratic and liberatory future than the one that they got. And then move 10 years forward to Beijing, to Tiananmen. And I was 15 years old when this was taking place, and I can remember communicating directly with Chinese students on VBSS, fully board systems and services, at the time that the democracy movement was scaling up in China. And then 10 years later, here in the United States, with what at the time was the largest uprising against global capitalism that had taken place in this country in generations, the protests against the World Trade Organization in Seattle, Washington. And then 10 years later still, 2009, the Green Movement in Iran. Again, this was not a successful uprising in the short term, but it has had lasting ramifications. And then to the present moment, a moment in which we have seen in the last few months, millions in the streets of Hong Kong, San Juan, Puerto Rico, Lebanon, Barcelona, Montreal, Quebec, with the climate strikes that just took place, the first major wave of global climate strikes this past spring. Algeria, successful revolution, it looks like, is taking place in Algeria right now, finally. Prague, Santiago de Chile, in Bolivia. And all of these are expressions of a different conception of democracy, of a thirst for democracy, a passion for democracy. It says that democracy doesn't just live in the ballot box, but it takes place when the people organize together, when they express popular sovereignty, a right to determine the future course of their society. And of course, not all forms of democracy involve mass demonstrations, general strikes, just as not all forms of democracy involve voting for somebody to make decisions for you. Democracy and demands for democracy can be expressed in the construction of institutions, like economic cooperatives and housing cooperatives, or in the practice of local governance that takes place at the community level all across the country and around the world. Right? So I want to bring us back again to 1969. And this is the student strike at Columbia, led by a coalition of community activists from Harlem and Students for a Democratic Society at Columbia University. And of course, here you see they're voting as they're taking part in the occupation at Columbia University in New York City. But what I want to draw your attention to in particular is the commitments that motivated the movements of the 1960s in this country and in many other countries. And that was a commitment to a form of democracy they came to call participatory democracy. And participatory democracy, that adjective, participatory, was tacked on in order to argue for the type of democracy that involves people in their daily lives and not just in selecting people to make decisions for them every so often, every year or every 4 years, depending on the scale of the election. And the guiding statement of Students for a Democratic Society was the Port Huron Statement, 1962, 1963, became popularized in 1963. And right there on the cover of the Port Huron Statement that was widely distributed and read by millions around the world at the time, you have this phrase, which I want to read to you. We seek the establishment of a democracy of individual participation governed by two central aims: that the individual share in those social decisions determining the quality and direction of his life. It's gendered. That society be organized to encourage independence in men and provide the media for their common participation. So the vision for participatory democracy that animated the movements of the 1960s and 1970s, the New Left, was a vision of a media ecology that was of, by, and for the people in order to liberate the individual. So it's democracy in the service of liberty. And that should be a familiar concept. And I know this is a familiar set of diagrams here, right? The idea of participatory democracy is the same idea as the blockchain. It is the same idea in an earlier incarnation as the internet. And in fact, many of the most influential early constructors of the internet came out of Students for Democratic Society, right? They were thinking, these are college students, they were at MIT. My dad was at MIT, he was working on living things. He's an economist, he's not a coder, but I have a little box that he made, a little early computer that I used to play with. Those lights would change colors and make sounds and so on, right? This is what these guys were doing, right? And they're thinking about what kind of society can we create? What can we contribute? How can we bring participatory democracy into the technologies of the future? How can we create distributed media, right? And in the 1980s, they not only went into sort of directly coding, but also creating the infrastructure for popular participation in the new internet and later the World Wide Web. So these are some institutions. How many people have heard of any of these institutions? IGC, APC, GreenNet. I'm not surprised to see no hands raised, okay? The Institute for Global Communications and GreenNet, based out of the UK, you can see sort of the 1980s version of their home screen, actually has a diagram and that appeared on their home screen later in the late 1990s. But they were the first to set up ISPs for people who were not connected to institutions like universities and the military and other major institutions. They were the first to bring the internet to the people, okay? And this was the left. You can see a peace net, anti-racism net, and so on, right? They did that work. And there was the construction of VBSS, forums, chat rooms, we call them today. It was the first opportunity for people around the world to talk to each other directly. Not in real time, but as close to it as we could get. And to have communications between Chinese students at the University of Wisconsin who were rallying 3,000 strong with their supporters, the support of the democracy movement in China, and those who were on the front lines in China, and for many of us who were concerned about what was going on. But we had the VBSs. We had indie media. This, I think, is the most important innovation that came out of the social movements of the 1990s. Independent media, an entire movement to create an infrastructure where the people could come together and do their own journalism, DIY, do it yourself, right? And to do it on a community basis, do it collectively. So the ability to upload files and reports, images, audio, that was indie media, they did it first, right? The ability to work collectively on editing, common media, before Google Drive and G Drive and so on. That was indie media, right? And there were independent media centers that were set up in hundreds of communities around the world, right? And this was the way in which Black people got their news in the 1990s. Moving forward a little bit, when major media in the United States could not get video out of Iraq in the beginning of the US invasion of Iraq, independent journalists like Jeremy Scahill, a buddy of mine from Wisconsin, right, were there at Abu Ghraib, and what did he do? He basically zipped up his data, he broke it down, and then he used FTP to send it to Democracy Now!, right? So the only video that was coming out of Iraq to viewers here in the United States was, again, independent media, movement media at this time. Right? Later on, the first online voting systems, the Green Party of the United States introduced online voting for delegates so that all the members of the party across the United States could see how their delegates were voting on their behalf. So this is actually a vote on accreditation of delegates to the National Party's convention. You can see I was the floor manager. That's from 2003 that was taking place. And then the first content management systems and the construction of Drupal, but also before Drupal, proprietary systems that were built by nonprofits. And in order to achieve the things that we now do with that all kinds of people do with CMSs, and then later with CRMs, right? And then single user login and multi-sites, right? These were all things that people in social movements were doing in order to create the democratic media they needed in order to be more effective at their work, okay? So this, I'm just sort of laying out, this is a piece of the picture here. Now, of course, activists, this is not new. Activists have always known that technology matters a lot, right? So, technology can afford liberty, it can afford collective organization, and struggles over the construction and distribution of printing presses, and then the suppression of the printing press in the 1600s, 1700s was important in many revolutions, including our own here in the United States. And of course, not only can technologies afford popular power and liberty, but they can also be used to restrict it. Activists know this, social movement scholars know this, everybody in this room, I think, knows this. And of course, even those technologies that have liberatory capacities can also be channeled, right? They can, if with sufficient capital brought to bear, they can be channeled in ways that end up constraining the possibilities for collective liberation. So what I would sort of submit to you, and this is not from my PhD research. I am a social movement scholar, I'm a social movement theorist, I'm laying out a theory here. I study constitutionalism, democracy movements, other things, right? I'll put this out there. Is that around 2000, around the turn of the millennium, you started to see a shift where coming out of the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, the generations that came out of the New Left were engaged in trying to build media and technologies for the people, right? And there was a lot of overlap with popular movements. Coders were part of popular movements. In the early 2000s, that relationship started to change, right? And it changed because capital came in. These technologies had value. There was an opportunity here to appropriate the innovations that had come out of the work that people were doing in university labs and in communities and so on, and to do it better, to be frank, right? This is another reason why I think popular movements are no longer at the front lines, the cutting edge of technological development, is that it's actually hard to do these things well, right? But this is what has happened. So the relationship between the coder community and technologists in general and capital is much more overlap. We spend more time with people with people in conferences in which you're looking for funding, you're talking to VCs, et cetera, and there's less of a relationship with popular movements than there have been in the past. Okay? And this matters. This matters because if you're in the project of building distributed ledger technologies like blockchain and holochain, then you're doing it in part, most of us, because you believe in the promise of distributed technologies to bring power to the people and to democratize our society. Right? But then the question is, what is your vision of democracy? And we all of us, bring our knowledge, our personal biographies, our network positionality, right? Basically our position in social networks, to our work. Our information is constrained by who we know and what we see on a daily basis. Right? And if we are not embedded in popular movements, then our conception of democracy will be impacted by it. So I'm going to lay out another set of categories. That of the people, so ordinary people. We are all ordinary people, all of us. All of us are in this category. We're all ordinary people. We go about our life, try to take care of ourselves and each other. We try to get to work, we try to get to the welfare office, whatever it is that we're doing, we try to get to school, right? We're all ordinary people. There's another category, which is that of activists. For social movement scholars, activists are ordinary people who have made a decision to engage in a project of social change. That's the only difference between an activist and an ordinary person. Activists are ordinary people, but they've committed themselves to a project of social change. In the social movements literature, we call that cognitive liberation. Okay? So activists are people who are thinking about how do we transform society, and they've committed themselves to that work. There's another category that matters, and that is of specialists. The specialists are ordinary people who have specialized skills and access to particular sources of power. Specialists can include clergy, they include politicians, they include doctors, they include lawyers, they include coders. Right? So here I have an image of public defenders. You can see they are very overworked. And I'm familiar with this world. I actually think of lawyers as being most analogous to coders in terms of the duties that lawyers have to the public, or should be operating with in our daily work. Right? And also in the sense that both deal with code, literally. I mean, the Constitution is the source code, right? And the statutes and the jurisprudence and the precedents and the prior holdings, that is the operating code, right? So that's the application. Right? And so just as lawyers have specialized access to the legal structures, to interpreting them, to contesting them, to explaining them, to providing representation, to providing counsel to ordinary people, right? And special duties. Because of that, I would submit that coders also have those special duties. We have all of us here who are engaged in coding or in the process of technological development have special duties to the people that we need to be thinking about on a regular basis. And those duties not just include caring about democracy, they include paying attention to who is in the room. Who are we? When we're engaged in a project of building a particular blockchain application, who is in the room? Who is actually part of the decisions that will shape the world of tomorrow? There's a fourth category, which is the power elites. And you can call them other things, right? And I thought, I'll just use Bill Clinton golfing. And this is the first image that came up. So there's Rudy Giuliani, Donald Trump, Michael Bloomberg, Bill Clinton, and two guys I probably should have looked at, right? But this is another category of ordinary people who have extraordinary power, who I think we interact with quite a bit in the process of technological development. So my challenge to everybody in this room, everybody gathered at the conference, is to be thinking about the question of democracy maybe in a different way than we regularly do. Not just thinking about what we believe the applications that we are developing, the systems that we're invested in, may afford in the future, but to be thinking about where we come from, who we associate with, who do we serve, right? Who is in the room? What is your relationship to activists who have knowledge about the construction of popular movements for democracy, who are actually engaged with that work? Like these folks here at Occupy Wall Street are directly embedded in that mobilization, right? And what is our relationship to the vast majority of people in this country who are poor or are on the verge of poverty? The vast majority of these people are living in precarity or in poverty right now, right? And are not even aware of the decisions that coders and the financiers of our projects are making that will shape their world for decades to come. I guess we have a few minutes left, so I'm going to end there. I'm happy to take any questions or discussion and challenges too. Thank you.
You mentioned the disadvantaged, the underserved, underrepresented, to fix or trying to keep people aware despite the digital divide that continues to take place.
Absolutely. So I think there's a couple things here. I mean, historically, it was the case that coders themselves were parts of these movements, and I think in greater numbers, right? So there's different types of digital divides. There's the digital divide of access, but the reality is, I mean, a lot of people who go into programming historically did not come from advantaged backgrounds, right? Or at least not in relative terms, right? So that it's a harder nut to crack. I think, because we may have a different, and I haven't done the research on it, we may have a different population of people who are going into coding and technology. We need to get a grasp on that, right? But practically speaking, I think there are active projects in popular movements that are about bringing technology to the people. And I think they need to be engaged with to a greater extent, right? And they're not, I mean, I am, in some ways, I'm not the ideal person to be speaking to this, right? But I am the person who's going to speak to it today, right? And say, there are, the APC is still out there, the Association for Progressive Communications. The IDC is still out there. There are others who engage in that work. And I can actually I have lots of connections from many years in the movement. I can put anybody here in touch with folks who are doing this work. So I think it needs to be built into blockchain events like this, as the organizers have done. I think that is important. But I think it needs to be done more deliberately in the future. And so that would be a first step. I'll act as Phil Donahue here.
As a former lawyer, how do you think that smart contracts will be sort of integrated into that life?
So my wife is presenting on a couple of panels later today, Sarah Manski, wrote about sort of the possible futures for the blockchain world for law and critique. And we took on the question of sort of future of sovereignty in the blockchain world. And smart contracts are, I think it depends, right? I mean, the questions that I've raised here get to the question of whether sort of the great sort of mass of people are even aware that smart contracts are something that are in development. No, most people don't know this is even happening, right? And I think there is also a problem with, we had a great presentation on open source earlier, right? I think there's also a problem with blockchain in the same sense, is when things get automated to that extent, right? What is the ability of people to engage in the deliberative process about the implications of smart contracts, right? So, I'm not sure if I'm getting at your question effectively. Is that an answer? Yeah? I mean, we need to bring blockchain to the people, is I guess what I would say, and all of its manifestations, all its implications. How many? Two. One more.
Thank you very much. This is not necessarily a question, but more of a statement that those of us who are in the room who may be working on a blockchain project or hope to do so in the future, before actually implementing it, make sure that you are consulting your customer base, the people who your project, your idea may be affecting before you actually implement a disruptive platform process into existence. Make sure that you're seeking them out and getting their opinion, because oftentimes we may think we know what they want. We need to go to them to find out actually what it is that they need before we actually put something into existence. And so this right here is close to my heart, and I definitely want to find out those who are implementing society including society in the process. I want to find that out.
That would be a great place to end. Thank you for making that point better than I did, so appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.